Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. What do you think we ought to do with all that nuclear waste that's being generated by nuclear power plants? If you live in Ontario and some other parts of Canada, you're you're probably aware of the fact that Canadians have more than our share of nuclear power plants, and these things generate a huge amount of radioactive material, which is harmful, to put it mildly. So today we're going to talk about that with a lady from the Indigenous community, Lorraine Rekmans. And she and I have just met, although I've heard of her before. And she's going to bring me up to date because I haven't followed all the details of the negotiations and things that are going on about the disposal of nuclear waste. Good morning, Lorraine.
Good morning, Meta. Thank you for inviting me.
It's going to be an important conversation because whether or not we know about nuclear waste, we are all in danger of being exposed to some of it. And the question is what to do with it. So I know that you're part of at least one of the organizations that have been meeting to address the question, or maybe the right word is to fight the issue.
Yeah. Well, let me talk a little bit about where I come from. I mean, I'm a band member at Serpent River First Nation, and I grew up in Elliot Lake, Ontario, which was home to one of the world's largest uranium mines. So
Mhm.
they operated from the mid 1950s until the 1990s. And my background is working, well, I worked in Elliot Lake as a journalist in the late 80s, early 90s. And I covered a lot of the environmental issues. So the mine, there were a number of mines that were licensed to operate in Elliot Lake, and they closed in the 90s. And when they closed, the federal government ordered an environmental assessment to decommission the mines because there was 150 million tons of radioactive waste that had been dumped into nearby lakes.
Oh,
So they were called waste management areas, but the practice is to mine the uranium, extract the ore from the rock with sulfuric acid, and then dump the tailings into nearby lakes.
is that still being done? I hope
That's the practice. That's how tailings are managed.
to,
So,
right now, still.
well, the mines are closed now, and
Well,
mines that are operating in Saskatchewan,
mhm.
I'm really not familiar with their operation, but that's how mine tailings are treated. So they're contained, they call them natural containment areas. There's all kinds of fancy names for them, but primarily in the beginning, they were lakes. So Elliot Lake,
Isn't that totally immediate? I assume it would completely contaminate the water in the lakes, so you could never use the water.
well,
It,
it actually displaced I mean, those lakes were filled. So you can imagine, I'll show you, I have an image from the book. This is the book, This Is My Homeland.
uh-huh.
So I was a
You're co-author or co-editor of the book?
co-editor of this book with Annabelle Dwyer, who works for, I think, the International Lawyers Against Nuclear Weapons. But anyway, if you can, I don't know if your
Well,
readers.
I'm not able to. I'm interested, but I'm not
Oh,
sure what I'm seeing. This kind of looks like yellow. Is
it's
that
failing.
a lake that's been filled in?
That's right. That's a lake that's been filled in with nuclear waste. So it looks like a fine powder. It almost looks like a desert sand. So anyway, the solution at Elliot Lake to contain those tailings was basically to flood it and keep it under a water cover. And that was sanctioned by the federal government in a environmental assessment. So you could see the effluent. You see the picture here with the effluent running out of the
Is that
pipe.
the orange stuff? Is the
Yeah,
effluent from it?
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's oxidizing. That's why it's orange because of the sulfuric acid.
Uh-huh.
So Elliot Lake is home to, the largest nuclear mines tailings dump in the country. And the stuff is contained by, I think there are 76 dams holding this stuff back. And it's just north of Lake Huron. So if you go to a map and you look for Elliot Lake, you'll see where the area is, and it dumps into the Serpent River watershed. and makes its way into Lake Huron. So in the 1980s, the International Joint Commission on Great Lakes Water Quality noted that Elliot Lake was a primary source of nuclear contamination in the Great Lakes area. And they were monitoring it in the 80s, they were monitoring for radioactive material in Lake Huron. But this impacts, so the issue, of course, is an environmental concern, but it also impacts on the treaty territory of the Indigenous people at Serpent River. So we are covered by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, and that is our traditional territory. And in our traditional territory, 10 lakes have been sacrificed to nuclear waste, so it's affected the wildlife and the vegetation around the area. And we've been notified in the past not to consume, large quantities of blueberries or, wild game from the area because they were feeding near the tailings.
Well, just how radioactive are the tailings? When they've taken all the ore out that they can, the residue is just dirt with a lot of.
No, it's radioactive. And so when you think about the decay chain of radioactive material, and I'm not an expert like Dr. Gordon Edwards, you might know Gordon Edwards.
Oh, yeah, I turn to Gordon every time I have a question. Yeah.
So Gordon explains how through the decay chain, the material actually becomes more radioactive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it starts out as low level radioactive waste, but as it decays and breaks down, it changes. So you end up with stuff like polonium. So, but the issue when they dealt with the environmental assessment, I always thought the environmental assessment at Elliot Lake was deficient in so many ways. One, they never counted for climate change. So to say we're going to maintain a water cover on top of these 10 lakes in perpetuity is impossible, because you have to draw water from other sources to maintain that water cover. And the only thing they were monitoring for in terms of runoff was looking at how acidic the runoff from the tailings was. They would add lime to neutralize the acid, but the water cover was really only to stop oxidization, I guess, of the tailings, to keep them away from the air, because otherwise you end up with that orange gunky stuff, right?
No, I'm sorry. What does happen? You end up with what? What happens to it if it's exposed to air?
Well, if it's exposed, it had, the weird thing is it had been exposed to air for decades before the 1990s, and it was blowing. Because they saw how fine it was. It was, migrating all over the place. So they're keeping the water cover on it to stop it from oxidizing, which is, I guess, the process where the sulfuric acid interacts and turns everything orange. So, anyway,
sorry, I'm this is all new thinking to me. Would it be possible to cover the stuff with something else besides water? Could you put concrete or something over it? Would that be better?
Well, I don't know if like the Nuclear Waste Management Organization right now is talking about a facility to dispose of nuclear fuel rods from the reactors, and they talk about cement casing, building huge cement boxes in the earth. However, one of the problems with cement is that it erodes because water will break down cement. Mm-hmm. That's just a fact of life. So it will never, it'll never be safe inside a cement casing. Right. But the issue at Elliot Lake is, I think, the way my dad used to always say, is the horse is already out of the barn. And so here we are stuck with these 10 lakes, and they're contained with these dams holding them back from, migrating further into the Serpent River water shed. So one of the concerns I had was, especially after the Mount Polley mine disaster in British Columbia. So you may be familiar with that accident.
Not.
Mount Poly was a mine that was mining gold, silver, and copper. And they had huge tailings ponds that were held back by dams, and those dams collapsed. And it released, tons of hazardous chemicals into the local environment. And the British Columbia government at the time ordered a review. They said, we must have a review of all existing tailings dams in the province to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I've been asking that the province of Ontario take the same action, especially given that these dams at Elliot Lake are decades old. And we have crumbling infrastructure. We know that if we don't maintain it and keep it up, we're just at risk. So in the environmental assessment at the time, the federal government scientists said it's not a matter of if these dams will collapse. It's only a question of when.
Really?
Yes. And so
federal government inspectors who said that.
That's right.
So
and
they would.
It's in the federal environmental assessment report.
Uh-huh.
So because I followed that process all along from my early days as a journalist to into this time, I've always been concerned with how that waste is treated, who pays for it, how do we keep future generations safe? That's the question. We created this huge radioactive mess, and we have to maintain it and manage it and protect future generations from any further disaster or further threat to their water quality. And I think one of the big things that struck me through this whole process is that there is no rationale for nuclear energy at the end of the day, because it is too water consumptive. And the big talk that's going on right now about climate change is that nuclear energy is not carbon intensive and there's no emissions, and all this other grand stuff about nuclear energy. However, we're not factoring in the true cost. We're not doing a full cost accounting of nuclear energy if we don't take into account the lakes that we have sacrificed, the water that we have wasted and sacrificed. And at the other end of that, after, through the nuclear chain, is the question of disposal of the long-term waste, which is the nuclear fuel rods. So they call them, the spent fuel rods, and they have all kinds of names like low-level radioactive waste, and it's radioactive at the end of the day,
Yeah, sure.
right? And Sister Rosalie Bertell always said, no dose is a safe dose.
Right.
There's no such thing as a safe dose. Whether it's low or high or intermediary, it's still radioactive at the end of the day. So, I think Indigenous, and I've said this before, is that Indigenous people have always been disproportionately impacted by resource development.
Well, that much I do hear about, I think, if anything, the Indigenous communities are doing the most to publicize the risks, seems to me, because I see references to that a lot. And for example, the Navajo in the US, they're really apparently greatly affected by the accumulation of radioactive risk in their territory.
Yes.
Tragic.
So it's, the cost, the thing is, no one talks about this. This is probably an aside to everything, but it's a violation of the treaty.
Okay.
Right.
Well, tell me about
within the 1850 treaty. We have rights to hunt, fish, and trap in that territory.
Tell me about your group and your role within it.
Well, I don't have a group. I'm a band member of Serpent River First Nation.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've worked with friends, to put that book together. And this book, This Is My Homeland, is just a collection of the stories of the Indigenous people and how they were impacted specifically by those mines at Elliot Lake.
Mhm.
It's a case in environmental studies.
When it
But
says this is my land, it's really talking about Indigenous land and
it's
see
my
the,
homeland, yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a number of groups, I think, in Thunder Bay, Indigenous people that are organized around, I think, the quest. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has a quest to find a site to dispose of the spent fuel rods.
Mhm.
Indigenous people are resisting that effort because they don't want to be holding the bag on this nuclear waste.
Of
There was
course.
no benefit to their community whatsoever from the production of uranium and from the nuclear fuel or nuclear energy industry.
Now, where have they been proposing or considering putting these sites, these disposal? I
Well, they
guess it's
were,
not going to be
yeah,
underground, right? And there have been, I knew 5 years ago some of the names of
yeah, Saugeen. I think Saugeen First Nation was one of the sites that had been identified, which is right next to Lake Huron.
Uh-huh.
I know they were looking, I think they traveled through, like, they looked at Elliot Lake at one time. They were near Hearst. So Northern Ontario primarily. And I think they were looking for granite rock formations. So they were talking about deep geological disposal. The idea, I think, what the idea initially was to dispose of it in containment facilities, looking at future retrieval. As science progresses, like could they go back there and dig this stuff up and do something else with it, right? So I think the issue, our history with Indigenous people, I'm saying our history with the nuclear industry has been a tragedy. Certainly don't want, it's not fair. It just isn't fair to ask someone else to bear the cost.
Of course.
If
But are they these places where they're proposing or considering burying the stuff? How much of that is on Indigenous territory?
well, Saugeen First Nation is it's all treaty territory too, also, right? See, this is one of the, and I'm going to get into sort of the politics of it a little bit because that's,
Please.
my background is really political. So if you look at the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, what it did was set up reserves. It set up Indian reserves and then identified the territory of those people. So Robinson-Huron Treaty was signed by 17 different First Nations. And that would stretch from it's actually from Sault Ste. Marie to Penetanguishene. So it covers the north shore of Lake Huron, down to the south. If there was an arrangement with anyone in that treaty territory, it would have to be agreed to by all 17 signatories to that treaty. You can't just deal with one band. And under Canadian law, currently, if the federal government wants to impact, if they want to impact on Indigenous land, there is a duty of consultation. So the Supreme Court has directed the government of Canada to consult with Indigenous people when it might take on an activity that's going to impact their territory. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is not the government of Canada. It's an organization of industrial interests.
Oh.
So in it, I think it was enacted by an order in council by the Canadian government. But it's really important to figure out who it is. Like, it's not Minister of Environment that's talking to Indigenous people. It's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So there's a lot of weird things going on.
Well, now, how would it have been if they had put people with different stakeholders with different conflicting interests into the same body. What you're suggesting, if I'm hearing you, is that all the people who are doing this planning are all people who've got a vested interest in finding a place to dump it, and it might be very well on the place where you live.
Right. Yeah. So it's important to understand who the players are. Like, I worked, and this is another side. So my background really is in resource development. So, and I'm a journalist, by trade. I've worked for Native organizations like tribal councils. I worked for an Aboriginal newspaper for a while. Worked for the National Aboriginal Forestry Association. And most recently, I was the critic for Indigenous affairs for the Green Party of Canada. And
good credentials. I hereby approve of you.
Oh, thank you. But no, I've worked a lot in politics and resource development and Indigenous rights issues. And you get a little dabble of, of Canadian law in there by, just by tracking all the legal decisions that come out. And that's why it's important to look at how this, it's not only what's going on, but it's how it's going on. I take issue with. That if the federal government is interested in, taking on responsibility to manage nuclear waste, then the indigenous community has to be consulted. And under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they call for free, prior, and informed consent. So free, prior, and informed consent would mean, as an Indigenous community, you would have the resources that you need to assess what's being proposed fairly.
It certainly sounds right to me. If I'm trying to think of any argument for the another point of view, it might be, well, the stuff exists. Where are we going to put it? If you don't want it in your land, what do you want to have done with it? Because it's not going to go away.
No, it isn't.
What is your notion of?
Well, what do I think? First of all, I would say stop producing the stuff.
Well, yes, but we know that's not going to happen immediately. I mean, even the most optimistic thing you could say is we'll wait till the power plants sort of run down and just don't refurbish them, because you're not going to have them shut it down tomorrow and have my apartment here go into a blackout because there ain't no power,
Right. Well, the discussion right now is evolving, and the industry is making proposals for these small modular reactors, which are basically nuclear reactors that you buy in pieces and put together. So they're already forecasting into the future that they're going to be producing small modular nuclear reactors.
Okay, now that I'm already on your team on that. Let's stop this. We're not going to build anymore. Let's say absolutely.
Okay, let's say we're not
way. No way.
Be aware.
What are you going to do with what's already here? That's what I'm worried about. Where do you put it?
Okay, Metta, I think I worked on the National Forest Strategy. And within the National Forest Strategy for Canada, we had multiple stakeholders. So a variety of, civil society, Indigenous people. We had people that worked in the forest, people that ran mills. So anybody basically could be part of that strategy. And we need a strategy. That's the thing. The Canadian government of Canada does not have a nuclear waste strategy. That's the first thing we need, is to force our government to come up with a strategy, collect those stakeholders, get all of those voices at the table. I really think that many hands, will make good work, because you will bring all these perspectives to the issue.
I don't want to argue with you, because I absolutely on your side, but I don't know. I'm still stuck with, even if you get the best people in the world together, you got this damn stuff, and where are you going to put it?
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I don't, you know, you ask if somebody were to ask me what I would do with it, I haven't a clue. You bury
Well,
it?
it definitely has to be managed. I agree it has to be managed. It has to be contained. But the thing is that industry has come up with this idea, right? It is the scientists that are industry based who have come up with this idea, and they're telling us it's the best proposal and it's the best option. We don't even have the resources to assess that proposal properly. You know, so how, and it becomes a question of trust again, too. How do we trust given what's happened in the past?
Mhm.
So I do think that we need a strategy, that the federal government needs to step up and take this on, and because it's in the national interest. How do we protect our environment and responsibly store nuclear waste? But this process is going on. They're already looking, they've dug holes and they've done site assessments in different territories across Northern Ontario. There's been, thousands of meetings. And, I'm saying, let's pull this back a little bit. Let's get the framework. Let's set a legal framework for how this thing is going to be done.
Okay, well, sure. I can't see why anybody would oppose what you're saying, but we're getting to the end of our conversation, and I still am stumped, because it's, the procedure, the process certainly needs attention, but there must be some alternative proposals out there floating around. Some people must have some ideas.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's a Southwest, I think the Southwest Research Station in Arizona has done some work with Navajo people, and they're looking at multiple types of containment facilities. So there is work going on around the world. It's happening.
Yeah, I've heard people say, well, leave it above ground. Where it is now, they keep it in containers someplace near the power plants, if not really on site of the power plants, and just leave it there. Don't bury it. Well, I'm not sure I'm happy with that, because, you take an airplane and crash it into one of those facilities, and what you're going to have, not fun. So I really don't. I mean, there must be other people who have good ideas that are circulating, because if nobody has a better idea, then you can have all of the get-togethers you want, and unless somebody's got a better idea, what are you going to do?
Well, I think it's not where, what is it? They say that it's not the journey or the destination, but it's the journey. And how we get there is important. How we get to the solution is just as important as the solution, because nothing is going to be effective if there's no relationship, if there's no trust. You can't just walk into an Indigenous territory and dump off a bunch of nuclear garbage and expect it to be okay because the scientists said, hey, you know what, it's safe, and we did all the the calculations. And I don't like having it underground either, because it puts groundwater at risk.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right? It puts groundwater at risk. And my experience over time has been that infrastructure is left to crumble decades and decades down the road because there is not somebody there. One thing about Indigenous people is they are there on the land for centuries, in the same place, watching what's happening and seeing what's happening. And that is the traditional ecological knowledge. Mm-hmm. Like myself, as an Indigenous woman, tracking the nuclear waste at Elliot Lake for decades and saying, you know what, those dams are really old. Somebody needs to look after them. Mm-hmm. My experience has led me to believe that people put something in the ground, forget about it, and walk away.
Yeah.
And in 100 years, we're talking, a life, was it the life of a radioactive particulate is like half-life is
Yeah.
500 years or 1,000 years.
Thousands of years, yeah, in many cases.
So how do we, I think, and that's why the process is important, Metta. That's why.
Well, I know that certainly you're right about the fact that people, they made this sarcophagus at Chernobyl and so on, and the same in the Marshall Islands, that there's a dome there where they put all of the waste from the nuclear tests, not all of the waste, but what they could collect, and they put it in this hole and covered it with cement, and that is crumbling, and apparently it is vulnerable underneath too, because now this stuff is seeping out into the ocean, and a tsunami or something would come along and knock the whole thing over. It would be stupendously dangerous. It is. And people, think, well, we've handled that. Goodbye. We'll go away, leave it. So it is certainly, number one message is don't generate the stuff. Leave it there in the ground where it's all safer, dispersed, That's for sure. And then the question is, now we've already got so much of it. Oh, yeah. Well, bless your heart. Thank you so much, Lorraine. It's a pleasure to get to know you. And
thank you, Metta. Thank you.
If
so
I
much.
give you some hard questions, it's because it troubles me, and I bet it troubles you too. That got to find answers, and it doesn't sound like anybody's got any good ones.
Well, it's good to get hard questions. Thank you.
Okay. Bless your heart, and let's be in touch occasionally. I want to follow what you're doing, and
okay.
I really appreciate your input and your, the fact that I count on. I just have the impression that the most responsible environmentalists today in the world are Indigenous groups, and so you're going to save us all. Okay, thank you.
Miigwech.